Okay, it is Saturday night, okay, at 8 o'clock, and this is Joe Firestone Live. Our topic for tonight is pushback on Medicare for All. And what's been happening on Medicare for All is, hi folks, how you doing? Hi Russell, hi Allison, how do you feel tonight? Rich, how are you doing? James, great to see you too. And hi, Emil. How are you? Hey, Rich. Hey, Allison. Okay, we've got a kind of a full blast show ready for you tonight. And the way we're going to do this is, right, Karen Reese says it's 5 o'clock out in California, okay, or Oregon, or the West Coast. I should know that because my daughter's out there in LA. Anyway, we have a jam-packed show tonight. And what we're going to do is we're going to go point by point through the static that is being generated by other people who claim to be progressive, who are pushing back against the Medicare for All push, going in from the left of the Democratic Party and from the progressive independents like ourselves. So I'm just going to go through these point by point. And there are quite a few points. I'm going to state a point, okay, of opposition, and then I'm going to answer that point. First, I'll fortify myself with a little coffee. Okay, first, the opposition says Democrats are not united in back of single payer. Well, that's certainly right. Certainly right. They certainly are not united in back of single payer. That, however, is not surprising, I don't think. Not a surprise to you, is it? After all, we've heard from Nancy Pelosi. She doesn't seem to be for single payer. And Chuck Schumer has declined to endorse single payer. And lots of other Democrats who supported single payer in previous years seem now to have some doubts about it. So there's also pushback from centrist Democrats who are saying that a Medicare for All push is a distraction from fixing Obamacare. My reply to that is, are they crazy? It was Obamacare that was the distraction from first single payer and then the public option. It was Obamacare that deep-sixed them both in 2009. First, the Medicare for All bill, this same H.R. 676, an earlier version of it, was taken off the table by the president and by Max Baucus. And then together, after the president claimed to support it, they torpedoed the public option. So they say that the Medicare for All bill is a distraction from Obamacare. And what we say, okay, is that Obamacare was fundamentally a bad bill because it was based on the marketplace and on private profit. And private profit and the marketplace do not mix in healthcare. They do not work together except to deprive people of good care and except to cause the death of people who would otherwise be alive today. That's a fact. And in America, those lives lost due to the fact that we chose Obamacare as opposed to Medicare for All in 2009, or actually we finally passed Obamacare in 2010, but we might have passed the Medicare for All bill in March of 2009 had the president backed it and had the Democrats been ruthless about it, like the Republicans have been ruthless in trying to get their repeal bill passed, right? If the Democrats had shown the same kind of ruthlessness with respect to Medicare for All in March of 2009, we would have had Medicare for All today. And something like 350,000 people who are gone might now be alive. Wonderful. So my reply to that is, are they crazy? And I suggest you ask them that question too. How about the cost of single payer? Well, ladies and gentlemen, is the cost really a problem for a monetary sovereign? Is there anybody in favor of at least partly financing a Medicare for All bill through deficit spending? These are questions you have to ask people who bring up cost. Why is cost a problem? What cost figure did they have in mind? We have in mind the cost figure of, I don't know, I figure it might be 25, 26, or 27 trillion over 10 years. It might be less. I could easily see it only being 2.3 trillion over 10 years. I'm sorry, no, I didn't mean, I meant but 22.3 trillion. Sorry, folks, I misspoke. But is that a problem for a fiat sovereign over 10 years? I don't think so. Why don't they talk about fiat sovereigns and what they can pay for? Why don't they talk about the additional policy space we have compared to other nations because we're a fiat sovereign? Well, now we come to the third objection, which is that the Dem leadership in Congress is not in favor of a Medicare for All bill. Well, I have a suggestion. Why don't we pressure the Democrats to such a great extent that they remove this leadership that is not in favor and that they bring in a new leadership? What about that? How about defeating Nancy Pelosi at the polls in 2018? How about that? How about announcing to Chuck Schumer that this is a new day? And that if he continues being the senator from Wall Street, he's not going to be the senator from anything anymore pretty soon. here's another objection. Well, the Democrats are using single payer as easy shorthand for a healthcare system that works better and costs less. But invoking Medicare for all or single payer by itself doesn't say much about policy specifics. Well, I certainly completely agree with that. That's why we have H.R. 676, a very nice 35-page bill that lays out specifics. Guess what? Specifics. Not a whole bunch of dodges and loopholes and write-ups, okay, and write-offs that take 2,300 pages to read, but a 35-page bill that most anybody can read and understand. That's what we have in H.R. 676. That's policy specifics, my friends. Okay, the Republicans had their repeal and replace slogan. Instead of having a repeal bill or policy specifics. There was a good reason for that. As soon as they produced the repeal bill, the CBO quickly shot him down. Very quickly shot him down. They pointed out 24 million people weren't going to have health insurance. That 22 million more people weren't going to have health insurance. And those were underestimates. Underestimates. Increasing the death rate from not having health insurance by 28,000 a year, or 30,000 a year, or 34,000 a year. So as soon as they revealed the policy specifics, that was a problem. But we don't have that problem, because as soon as people read H.R. 676 and see what's in there, they're going to like H.R. 676 a lot. And we're going to have to explain to them that it's better not to have that 5% tax in there that's supposed to finance it. Because it's best for the economy if we finance it with deficit spending. Not entirely with deficit spending, okay, of course. But the difference between what we're spending now and what we would have to spend on a Medicare for All bill year, or per year, ought to be financed by deficit spending. That would provide a tremendous lift to the economy, a tremendous lift to GDP, and would create, according to a study done by National Nurses, actually the California Nurses Association, as they were known in 2008. They later joined up with the NNU. That study showed a net gain of 2.5 million jobs from single payer, and it did not even assume deficit spending. It did not even assume deficit spending. So, and another objection is, well, in opposition, the Democrats don't have to deal with the hard trade-offs if a Medicare for All bill were passed. Hard trade-offs? Which hard trade-offs? Are we talking about the trade-offs between the insurance company death panels and any constraints and restrictions that might be imposed by the bureaucrats in the federal government? Well, based on our experience in the Medicare program and comparing it to the experience in private insurance, that most people have today, it seems to me the death panels are in the private insurance industry, not in Medicare. And they're even less likely to be in a Medicare for all bill, or to be a consequence of such a bill, when that bill is funded by a monetary sovereign government and by deficits. So I come back to the question, what hard trade-offs are they talking about? Well, maybe we'll learn just a little bit more about that as we go through here. H.R. 676 proposes an expansion of a Medicare program to all Americans. Well, sorry for that objection. It may be billed as that, but it is not actually that. It is a Medicare for all bill, but it is an improved Medicare for all bill. And the way it's improved is that every kind of basic care is included in it. Dental care is included. Chiropractic care is included. Psychiatric care is included. Pharmaceuticals are included. All of it is available with no copays and no deductibles. All tests, everything is included in John Conyers' H.R. 676 bill, except for cosmetic treatments. Everything else is in there. So it's much more than an expansion of the current Medicare program to all Americans. It's a recreation of Medicare and a great improvement to Medicare. The primary thing it has in common with Medicare is that while Medicare is not fully a single-payer program, there is a part of it that is single-payer, that part of it that it covers, but H.R. 676, once again, would cover everything. All basic care of all kinds, okay, that anyone would want, all care they would need from day to day as they're growing up, in middle life, in old age. It would all be covered by this very comprehensive program of the federal government. By the way, more comprehensive than comparable programs in many other nations. Now, there are many of us who say today, boy, wouldn't it be great if we had a program as good as the Canadian program here? H.R. 676 provides for a Medicare for All program that is better than Canada's, better than New Zealand's, better than Australia's, better than France's. Broader coverage all around. It would be the equal of any program in the world in relation to coverage. It leapfrogs over a lot of nations that currently have better systems than we have. Of course, now the bill is funded through existing government revenue tax increases on the top 5%, okay, of earners. So what the proponents of H.R. 676 will often say is they'll say 95% of the population is going to gain from this bill. The only people who will lose from it in terms of losing money are the top 5% of the population. But as we envision the Medicare for All bill, as a modification of H.R. 676, it would be a clean bill. It would not specify any more taxes specifically targeted at wealthy people, or corporations for that matter. And one criticism of the bill is, but, the text of the bill is only 30 pages. It should be longer. How can it say anything in 30 pages? Well, go ahead. I challenge them, and I challenge you to read this 30-page bill. Just Google it. You can easily find the link to the text of the bill. Go read it. It's got a lot in there when it comes to benefits. A lot in there. I think you'll have a hard time finding anything missing. And all in 30 pages. Gee, maybe these bills don't have to be that complex after all. Maybe there's a reason why some of the bills we hear about today have 1,300 pages in them, and 1,600 pages, and 2,300 pages, and 1,900 pages. Maybe the reason is that the people putting the bill in front of Congress for passage don't want any real people looking into it. Don't want any of us to be able to read it. Don't want any of us to be able to understand the fine print. A short bill like H.R. 676 is an advantage. It is not a disadvantage. It is not by itself an objection. So, critics, what isn't in H.R. 676 that you think ought to be in there? I mean, remember, it's legislation. It is a bill. It is a law. It is not the U.S. Code. The code corresponding to the law is written by the executive branch through its regulations and executive orders. That stuff is not to be written by Congress. Okay, someone known as a progressive Democrat from Maryland, somebody new to the Senate, Jamie Raskin, says, quote, "We will defend the Affordable Care Act pragmatically as the right foundation upon which to build, but we can define the goal as health care that will include all Americans." Screw Jamie Raskin. The Affordable Care Act is a market-based bill. It's a neoliberal bill. It's about competition in the market. The last thing we want to do now, after the market failures in the health insurance industry for so many years, is to pass a bill that continues to allow those companies to exist, that continues to allow those markets to exist. Those are the markets that have been killing people. There is no way we want to start out with the Affordable Care Act and pragmatically build on it. We don't want to have a bill that's still allowing more than 30 million fatalities per year to be incrementally improved so that the losses, I'm sorry, I should have said killing more than 30 million people per year. I'm sorry, 30,000 people per year, not covering more than 30 million people per year. we don't want a bill like that to be incrementally improved so it only kills 20,000 a year. We want to get rid of that evil of unnecessary fatalities completely. We don't want any more of them. To allow them to occur through the positive act of passing a bill that allows them to occur is immoral. It is a conscious violation of the human right to universal health care. You cannot have truly universal health care under a market-based bill. Not without heavy, heavy, heavy regulations that will truly control the market. And if we continue to allow our insurance companies to exist, they will never accept such a solution. They will work from day one to undermine and use their political power to block any bill of that sort. It will never be accepted. The best thing is that when we get the votes, we end them. We have to campaign on that. We have to put that on our platform. Yes, that is what we need to do. It's what we should run on in 2018 and 2020, say many. They're talking about a Medicare for All bill. And I agree with them, but I think it's got to be a specific Medicare for All bill. A relatively uncompromising bill, like H.R. 676. There are many others, though, who say, okay, this is another objection, that we need incremental change first. Bernie Sanders recently said that. Himself recently said that. I say no, 1,000 times no. Let us get this done now. We've been beating around the bush now for more than 100 years. Halfway hasn't gotten us to universal coverage. It hasn't got us to end the fatalities. The unnecessary fatalities have been going on for all of that time. We've got to stop them now. So some of the critics point out, but there are other paths to universal health care. There's the public option. There's the German system, which works very well. Well, the German system does work very well. It does. And it does cover everyone. But not without a set of regulations that would be totally unacceptable to our insurance companies. The German insurance companies accept them because Germany is culturally different from ourselves. The strength of individualism is not as strong there. And the right to private profit versus the right to collective goods is not as strong in Germany as it is in the United States. There, and in all the European countries, there's a greater emphasis on collective good than there is here in the United States. That's written into many of their cultures. There's greater respect and obeisance to authority there than there is here. So there may be more space for private insurance companies that know their place. But here, we will never get private insurance companies that know their place. We will never get private insurance companies that would permanently agree to subordinate themselves to the public purpose and to view themselves as an instrument of the public purpose. I don't believe that would ever happen. So I don't think the German system could work. And as far as the public option is concerned, look, we hashed that out in arguments in 2009 and 2010. We don't have to go through all that spilling of electronic printers ink again. It was clear then that a public option that was going to be successful would drive the insurance companies out of business anyway. Because to be strong enough to compete with them, it would have to be strong enough to outcompete them. You could not balance the public option company on a fine edge that would prevent it from driving the private companies out of business. In fact, in Jacob Hacker's original proposal for a public option, the plan was for the public option to cover 130 million people so that the private companies could never compete against it. And the way it was sold to many liberals at that time was, well, it's just going to be a transition to a Medicare for All plan anyway, because the public option would drive out of business all the private companies. So what did the private companies do? They negotiated, and they negotiated, and they negotiated some more with the public option representatives. And finally, there emerged out of the House committee, and with Nancy Pelosi's consent, there emerged a public option bill to be considered by the House, which CBO said would cover a maximum of 10 million people. Now that's a bill to put a smile on the face of those private companies, because they knew that they'd be able to destroy such a public company. And they also had written into the legislation other hedges that prevented the public option from effectively competing with them. And still, they were afraid enough of it to still work hard to kill the public option. They worked as hard to kill the public option as they would have worked to kill a Medicare for All bill, if that was still on the table. Nothing was gained by trying to pass a minuscule public option, and nothing would be gained again if we went that way this time. The public option is a trick sparkle pony. It is a distraction from the real business at hand. That was known in the summer of 2009. It was known in the spring of 2010 when the public option bill just fell by the wayside and Obamacare was voted on as the final effort of the Democratic Party. Well, Medicare for All can have long lines and rationing. Isn't that a major objection to Medicare for All? Well, I don't know about you, But those 30 million people still uncovered by Obamacare have real rationing to face. They don't have any help in paying for their health care at all. You know, many of them just can't get it. And as for long lines, there's no line longer than the one that you can't get on. And there are still more than 30 million people who can't get on the health insurance line at all under Obamacare. And back in 2009, there were maybe 45 million people who couldn't get on that line. So the comparison is the long line, the infinitely long line that exists when there's no health insurance, versus the long lines that might exist with insurance. But let's face another fact here. In some of the single-payer companies, some of the single-payer countries, we do see substantial lines. How long they are is generally greatly exaggerated by the American press, which has been bought by the oligarchs. We all know that. Okay? Those lines are thought to be easily bearable by people in France or people in Canada or people in some of the other single-payer countries. Now, of course, there are exceptions. And there are people who go outside of those countries for care because they don't want to wait. But let's keep one thing in mind. The lines are much less long than we make them out to be. And second, the rationing that occurs is a function of the shortage of funds in those nations, many of which are no longer monetarily sovereign. And those that are monetarily sovereign are gripped by the austerity ethic. So they've been starving their healthcare systems. I mean, the NHS in Britain has been getting gradually starved and privatized for years. But the Brits say it's still much better than ours. They'd much rather have theirs than ours. So, this long lines and rationing thing, that's something the right wing, it's a right-wing fairy tale that's been thrown at single-payer healthcare since before there was single-payer healthcare in many of these countries. And the countries that have since gone on to single-payer healthcare are not impressed with that particular problem. They certainly don't think that it affects the bottom line of whether they should have single-payer healthcare or not. It's at most a side issue. And also the objectors say many Canadians in emergency situations come to the United States where there is no wait. Well, I live in the United States, and I'm here to tell you that there's always a wait. Also, the definition of an emergency situation is often very subjective. Now, here in the United States, I have found that when I have an emergency situation, that I don't have to wait very long at all. But people who live in Canada say that when they have a real emergency, then they don't have to wait very long at all either. There are many people who say that. They even say it on American television when they get interviewed. You have to ask how many people are coming to the United States where there is no wait. No wait. Well, I just recently saw a debate. It's pretty dated now. I think it took place in 2012. Okay, there was a panel discussion with a number of people on it. One of the people was Danielle Martin, who is now well known here in the United States because people have been playing back a grilling she got from Senator Burr, Richard Burr, in 2014, who tried to get her to reveal the shortcomings of the Canadian system. Most probably because she had written a book on 6 ways to improve the Canadian system. Okay, so she well recognized the faults of the Canadian system. And she got into a discussion with somebody else on the panel about how many people come over to the United States for care. And estimates came up. And those estimates were in the hundreds of people. In the hundreds. Maybe 600, maybe 700 people who came to the United States because they thought if they did not do so, they perhaps would die if they'd stayed in Canada. Now, we have no way of knowing whether they would have died or not, or whether this was just a subjective feeling on their part, or what the diagnosis of the doctors in Canada were. All we know is that they were people who could afford to come over here, and they did come over here, and they got their treatment over here. So maximum, there were 600 or 700 lives at stake, and 600 or 700 people perhaps were saved as a result of the fact that they could afford to come here rather than stay in Canada. Now, there are 33 million people who live in Canada. 600 or 700 people is a very, very small percentage of people. We have roughly, maybe 50 million people here who are uncovered. And we have, if we had 50 million people who are uncovered, at this time, we would have maybe about 58,000 fatalities at that point, which was supposed to be a place we would get to under Trump care. Okay. Well, I personally would take a trade-off of 58,000 versus 700 or 800 people any day in the week. I would certainly also take a trade-off of something like 35,000 people, the Obamacare situation right now, versus 700 or 800 whose lives may have been saved by coming over here, may or may not have been saved by coming over here. So yes, There are trade-offs. There will be mistakes made, and people who need emergency treatment of a particularly expensive kind may not get it in Canada in a timely fashion where they can get it here. But it looks like the error rate is very low based on the statistics that are talked about. Now, yes, there shouldn't even be one person who's a victim of that. There should be no errors made. But we're talking about actually medical diagnostic errors here. Those people could not have treatment because of medical diagnostic errors that said they could wait. Now, do you want to know what the deaths per year here are for people who are on insurance, who have coverage, and who get treated as a result of medical diagnostic errors? Well, last I looked at the statistics, it was approaching 100,000 people a year. So diagnostic errors occur in our system, okay, as well as in the Canadian system. And of course, I haven't covered all of the diagnostic errors which occur in the Canadian system. I'm sure there are many more than the 700 or 800 here. These are simply diagnostic errors with respect to those who came here. I'm sure there are many more diagnostic errors in Canada than that. But it's good always to keep in mind these comparisons, because these numbers don't exist in a vacuum. They're not absolutes. So, there is low imposed government pricing. If we had the low pricing imposed by the government, the objectors argue, then what we get from the drug companies and from the medical establishment would be a stifling of innovation. When I read that, I almost couldn't contain myself. I almost broke down in laughing. And the reason why is that it's long been known that in our country, most of the basic research that goes into innovation, in other words, the real innovation that's done here, is done in government laboratories by government scientists. That research is mostly made available to private sector people, and then what they normally do on that is marginal innovation. They develop essentially medical products from that. And they do marginal variations of the medical products so they can compete versus other companies and get patents for marginal innovations so they can charge us all exorbitant prices. That kind of thing is going on all the time. We don't need that kind of innovation. For every Tesla that is out there in the private sector, there's a private sector hack creating a marginal innovation off a real government-produced advance. I'm not at all convinced that within a situation where the insurance companies are out of the loop, that we have any slowdown of innovation at all. Even if this did lead to lower pharmaceutical prices. One reason why is the pharmaceutical companies would still be competing with each other. So they'd still have to innovate to stay in business. So why would their innovation stop? And insofar as it does stop, because they only want to innovate in areas where they can make some very healthy profit, then we can do just as well by having government scientists do the innovation in that area. Who invented the internet? It wasn't the private sector, folks. Okay. How much health care will be permitted in expensive end-of-life situations? Well, I don't know. That's going to depend upon what people want. It's going to depend upon the political needs which are expressed in the system. But I'll tell you one thing. The kind of rationing that goes on in expensive end-of-life situations right now, because of shortages in government-run healthcare programs due to austerity, doesn't have to exist anymore for a monetary sovereign like the United States. So if we want to spend a little more money on expensive end-of-life situations, then we can have that here. We're not constrained by the kind of spending limits that you see in the European nations. So, what if somebody wants to pay out of pocket for faster or experimental treatment? Well, my answer to that is, we'll let them go to the United States and pay out of pocket for faster or experimental treatment. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said the United States because we would be single payer. But there might be other nations that would allow people to pay out of pocket. I don't know how I feel about people paying out of pocket to live longer than other people. I guess that's a political issue that we'll have to work out. If we want to allow people to pay out of pocket, to prolong their lives at the expense of the equality in the system, then we can vote for that. We can allow that to happen in the system. But from my personal point of view, I'd say go outside the country and get that kind of care. I'd rather have the greater equality here than have that kind of individual freedom. And then there are more points from the leftists, the so-called leftists, the faux leftists. Points like, we are not having a debate. Single payer has turned into a litmus test for Democrats. Democratic candidates are being threatened by the progressive base. My reply to that is, so what? It's been a long time coming A long, long time coming. It's about time there's such a litmus test. And about not having a debate. When have we ever stopped having a debate? We've been debating single payer in one way or another at least since 1948. At least since Harry Truman. We've debated single payer against any possible variation, year after year after year. We don't need a fresh debate now. We see single payer systems all over the world. And we see that they are number 1 in healthcare, number 2 in healthcare, number 3 in healthcare, number 15 in healthcare, number 30 in healthcare. And we also see that we're what, number 37 or 38? Maybe HR 676, in fact, I'm sure HR 676 won't be a perfect system. But as you faux progressive folks are so fond of saying, the perfect is often the enemy of the good. We know from the experience of other nations that the good here is a single payer system. And the bad here is some kind of market-based private sector system where healthcare depends on profit. We know that. It's as plain as the nose on your face. It's been going on for years and years and years all over the world, and American health has been losing ground to other countries for years and years and years. Okay, the Canadians don't have near the best healthcare system in the world, okay, according to some measures. I don't know, maybe they're 15th, maybe they're 20th, or something like that in some kind of ranking on those things. However, very few Canadians would trade in their system for our system. And very few Americans, once they understand what is an HR 676, would prefer to have the latest version of the neoliberal trick sparkle pony which emerges from the policy wonk shops in Washington, D.C. Because we've had ample experience with that kind of thing. We don't need another debate as in 2009, when most of the establishment progressives suddenly shifted over to the public option because that was the flavor of the year, and started pushing like hell for the public option trick sparkle pony, and took Medicare for all off the table as a result, and played into the hands of Obama and the health industry in doing so. We've seen that happen now once too often. We know that the incremental approach kills people. We know that. We've seen it. We've had that experience. We don't need to learn that lesson again. The lesson of the 1970s, the lesson of 1994, and the lesson of 2009 is that incremental approaches in the healthcare field do not work. They do not get us closer to Medicare for all. It's been now more than 40 years since Teddy Kennedy failed to get his single-payer bill passed in the early 1970s, even though he had a Democratic Congress. It's too long. It's too long that we've debated and we've considered the incremental approaches. There will always be an incremental approach. There will always be an approach that seeks to preserve the insurance industry as it exists and as it has developed over the years. We have to face the fact that that industry is a killing machine, committing murder by spreadsheet. And we need to get rid of it now or as soon as we can. Our opposition to it must be implacable. That's it. It's also claimed, well, Medicare for All supporters engage in intellectual dishonesty by claiming that a tremendous majority of Americans support single payer. Really? The conflation here is supposed to be between Medicare for All and single payer. Well, right now, the Medicare for All bill that's on the table is H.R. 676. And it is a great version of single payer. And if you do a survey and you describe what's in H.R. 676, you poll on that, I think you will get a tremendous majority of Americans supporting single payer. I don't think this is intellectual dishonesty. This is what would happen. And this is why the polling companies won't poll on that. Why they just use the vague Medicare for All or the vague single payer, which can mean anything. They don't want to describe the bills because the choice among these bills is obvious. We're supposed to conflate the popularity of universal coverage with the popularity for single payer. But the fact is, we can be sure that H.R. 676 is going to produce universal coverage. We can be sure of that. We can't be sure that any of these neoliberal alternatives will produce that right of universal coverage for people as an operative right. Often you hear the objection, state-level systems proposing Medicare for All have been rejected as too costly. But this is not an issue for a monetary sovereign. The issue of the day is passing single payer at the national level as soon as we can. And the bill of the day is H.R. 676. And that bill is a bill that can be passed by a monetary sovereign. And literally, any deficit spending required that bill can easily be handled by the monetarily sovereign United States government. Not only that, but the deficits that would be produced by the additional expenditure over current expenditures by the government caused by that bill would be good for the economy, not bad for the economy, would expand the economy considerably. So the state level objections are just a joke when we're talking about H.R. 676, because we're not talking about a state-level bill. So what people often say is we shouldn't squander this opportunity to improve Obamacare by making Medicare for All bill the hill we die on. But I'm sorry. The problem is the market-based system. Any improvements we make to Obamacare will still leave it a market-based system that places company profits over human lives. That is a bill which is inherently evil and was inherently evil from day one. It is a bill we never should have passed. It is a bill that must be killed now. And to hell with Barack Obama for taking Medicare for All off the table and working to pass that kind of bill instead. Here are even more points. Well, the suggestion has come out for the state of Maryland, actually by Dave Dian in The Intercept, that all-payer rate setting in Maryland could accomplish both cost-cutting and universal coverage of single payer. And universal coverage goals of single payer, making them functionally the same in important respects. He said this in a recent analysis of the possibilities in Maryland being the first state to reach a single-payer program. Okay. I think his argument's a credible one. I think that could happen in Maryland. Okay, I mean, I think that he's right to discuss it in a state setting because states are not currency sovereigns. And the costs of new medical programs at the state level have to be carefully budgeted out because they are constrained by the lack of currency sovereignty. But this model doesn't carry over to the federal level. It's not relevant for the debate over H.R. 676. So that's the answer to that particular objection, okay, if anybody brings it up. And here's Bernie Sanders. What we need to do is, among other things, in my view, this is a quote, among other things, in my view, lower the cost of prescription drugs, save consumers, save the government substantial sums of money. What we need to do is provide for a public option in every state in this country. What we need to do is lower the cost, lower Medicare eligibility from 65 to 55, and then begin the process of doing what every other major country on earth is doing, and that is guaranteeing health care to all people as a right through a Medicare for All single-payer program. All I can say to that is, it's another incrementalist strategy. In 2009, that incrementalist strategy produced Obamacare, which has distorted the whole debate on healthcare since then, because all the Democrats had to embrace Obamacare and hug Obamacare and hug Obama for political reasons. They couldn't criticize him for passing that terribly faulty neoliberal bill. And they didn't. And they persuaded themselves over time that it really was a good bill. I don't want to get into that game again. I don't want to get into saving some people some money and leaving others to die. I don't want to get into passing something now and then find there's no legislative space in Washington to pick it up again for another 3-4 years, and then find myself 8 years from now, find us 8 years from now, still without a Medicare for all program like H.R. 676. I'm sorry, Bernie. That's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. You think something's unacceptable? That's unacceptable. But the objectors say, well, the wonks, there were a lot of wonks who criticized Bernie during the campaign. Where are the Medicare for All wonks needed to defend Medicare for All? And they continue, the activist left has had difficulty dealing with criticisms. What difficulty is there dealing with criticisms? Did I have difficulty dealing with the criticisms tonight? I don't think I had any difficulty dealing with the criticisms. I think the criticisms were illegitimate, and they came from a place where people believe inherently in neoliberal partnerships with the government rather than government programs. And the claim is made that the Conyers bill is seen as symbolic. I mean, what do you mean symbolic? It's 35 pages of specifics about the healthcare problem that can be passed into law tomorrow. Now, I don't favor passing it into law tomorrow. I'd like to take out the taxation provisions. But I'm here to tell you the United States would be a hell of a lot better off if it were passed tomorrow just as is than it is now. Much, much better off. It's not a symbolic bill. Why do they say it's a symbolic bill? Because it doesn't have all the details of compromises with the insurance companies and with the system as it exists now. Instead, it's a bill that within a year would replace that system with something else and something far better. And that would disturb the lives of a good many people. But much fewer people than those whose lives are disturbed right now by the hardships that our current health insurance program and our current healthcare system puts them through. They number in the millions and millions and millions and millions. So forgive me if I'm not going to weep a bunch of tears for the 500,000 or so who might be inconvenienced by this bill. It's also said by these people that, well, again, there are difficulties at the state level. Look at California, where the Medicare for All bill just foundered on the details of how to pay for it. It didn't founder on the details of how to pay for it. It foundered on the opposition to it by a neoliberal legislator in a high position within the Democratic Party in California who was in a position to block this bill and use the how you're going to pay for it thing as an excuse. The bill was always intended as a bill that would specify programs and benefits, and that would leave to another bill the details of how you're going to pay for it. And the single-payer supporters in California were ready to take up that other bill after this one was passed. And the Democrat who blocked it betrayed the party and the interests of all the people in California by blocking it. And he blocked it because he was a bought person, as you can trace from his contributions. It didn't founder on details. It foundered on neoliberalism. And it foundered on the corruption inside of the Democratic Party. That's what it foundered on. They also say at the national level, there's no step-by-step legislation dealing with the transition from what we have now to the program under H.R. 676. Well, as far as I can read in the legislation, all the steps we need that can easily be specified by a legislature, or that should be specified by a legislature, are there. Now, the specifics of the transition can be executed by the executive branch as is intended by the Constitution. There was no problem when Lyndon Johnson implemented our current Medicare bill in 1966. We didn't even have at our disposal the computer systems that we have today. We had fairly primitive ones. And it was handled by the government, by a government who wanted to handle it, quite expeditiously and with a minimum of disruption. And people have been very pleased with the result, by and large, since that time. There is no reason to believe that the transitions that we'd have to go through to implement this particular bill would be any more exacting. It is said that the Democrats need better work from wonks on Medicare for all. Why? Go to the pnhp.org site. There's plenty of wonk work there on H.R. 676 and on Medicare for all more generally. It's been going on for years. Maybe the popular writers from journals like The Atlantic and the New Republic and The Nation should look at some of that wonk work. The wonk work they haven't been reading because Medicare for all hasn't been on the table. The wonk work they don't read because they've always been in favor of Obamacare. You have to look behind the curtain on these articles. Who are the people writing them? What have they stood for in the past? What do they stand for now? This business about the Dems need better work from wonks on Medicare for all, that's concerned trolling. It's not a valid objection. The point is made, well, current Medicare is not a single-payer system. Its expansion to everyone else also would not be. Huh? The expansion, or better, recreation, specified in H.R. 676, certainly would be a single-payer system. The most thoroughgoing single-payer system available in the world today, perhaps. There may be more thoroughgoing systems that are national health services, full-blown national health services, but systems that just concern themselves with insurance and how that's going to work, there would be no better system in the whole world. And then one more very favorite objection. If we perform this change, it would be a tremendous economic shock to the system, and the program would face extreme opposition from fear of loss during the transition. Fear of loss of what? It's part of legislation that you can go to any doctor or hospital or any healthcare provider you want to in the United States, and the government will pay for your services. The government will pay for your treatments. The government will pay for your tests. The government will pay for your drugs. No copays and no deductibles. Who in his right mind would have a backlash to that in comparison with what they have now? There is no insurance company that provides that kind of excellent coverage. I mean, they all have networks. They all only pay for things in their networks. They all have their death panels. And it said, loss aversion is a force to be reckoned with. Well, it's a force to be reckoned with if you're going to insist on maintaining a market-based system. But if you're willing to guarantee to people the privilege of going to any healthcare provider in the system and getting treatment, there's not going to be any backlash to that. I mean, why would there be? And the point is made, we'd be forcing over 70% of the adult population of the United States, including tens of millions of people who have decent coverage from their employer or the union or the Veterans Administration or the federal employees' health benefits program, to give up their current insurance for Medicare. Well, first of all, the kind of Medicare coverage specified in H.R. 676 is better than anything that exists in these other programs, except for VA coverage and maybe TRICARE coverage. I think it's better than TRICARE coverage. But VA is a national health service in miniature. So maybe that would be better. I don't know, but it wouldn't be better from the standpoint of providing as many choices as H.R. 676 would provide of providers. So I doubt there would be very many people who would actually prefer the VA system. There are many people who, when they want treatment, have to travel miles and miles and miles to get to a VA hospital or to get to their VA services. Under a Medicare for All system, they would not have to. Nor would we have to end VA coverage if the veterans wanted VA coverage. I mean, let them have a place in both systems. They can have their VA coverage if they want it. They can take advantage of Medicare for All if they want it. In a monetarily sovereign system, to allow that is to incur small potatoes when it comes to additional costs. I don't think that's a real objection. And other than the VA, I don't think there would be better coverage available anywhere. Certainly not in the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program, which still requires co-pays and deductibles as far as I know. People are still paying out of pocket for that. Here's another objection. There are many employer-provided policies that cover more than Medicare does. Well, yeah, than Medicare does now, but not more than what H.R. 676 would provide. Of course, the point is often made, has been made from the beginning of discussions of public health care systems, that there are many doctors who would not participate. Well, many is a very qualitative word here. What percentage of doctors would not participate in a Medicare for all program that included everybody in the United States virtually? Who would give up that market for a much smaller market? Maybe doctors with a concierge practice where they charge an arm and a leg for anything. Well, let them have their concierge practice. Most of the people in the United States can't avail themselves of that anyway. For 99% of the population, it doesn't matter that some few doctors would fail to participate. It just doesn't matter. That's the truth. Next, since we start from such a high level of spending, Medicare for All may not be able to bring costs into line with our nation. So it's often said that, and I've said it myself, that if we take on Medicare for All, we could get to the point in a very short time where we were spending about the same percentage of GDP as other comparable nations. So Canada now spends something like 10%, okay, of its GDP. We spend between 17 and 18%, may even be up to 18% now, on healthcare, okay? And so they're saying we might not be able to get it down to 10%, or we might not be able to get it down to the level of our nearest competitor, which I believe is Switzerland at something like 13%, okay, or something like that. So we might not save that much money. Well, the administrative costs in the private health insurance industry, as far as I know, are still running somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%. And the costs in a Medicare program, the overhead costs, can be expected to be somewhere in the neighborhood of perhaps 2%. So without any other economies in the system at all caused by single payer, just by removing those overhead costs due to private insurance, we can come close to getting down to that 12% okay, of GDP, which would allow us to save fully 1/3 of what we spend now as a percent of GDP on healthcare. And that's something like $1.2 trillion each year, or $1.1 trillion each year. That's the money that would not go into insurance company pockets, but that would be spent into the rest of the economy or saved but to a great degree spent in order to attain a higher standard of living. And that would boost our economy a tremendous amount just by virtue of the redistribution of expenditures from a top-heavy healthcare industry that extracts wealth from the people in it and brings that wealth to a higher level into other areas of the economy where that same extraction either cannot or does not happen. We always have to keep that in mind. Okay, Medicare gives good basic coverage, it is said, but it doesn't pay for everything. Well, HR 676 would pay for almost everything we need, as I said, except for cosmetic surgery. But it's not like current Medicare in that way. Dental costs are not extra. Chiropractic costs are not extra. Pharmaceuticals are not extra. Psychiatry is not extra. Probably over time, natural healing practitioners would not be extra either. That's probably something we can get in there, administratively. Only cosmetic procedures would not have a place in this bill, but just about everything else would. And finally, there's the objection: we should not make promises we cannot keep. Well, okay, of course, we should not make promises we cannot keep. But at this point in time, we're not sure whether there are not some promises that look like we can keep, turn out to be promises we can't keep. I'm pretty sure that everything I said here tonight, in terms of things that might be interpreted, as promises, are reasonable promises under HR 676. It may be some things are not going to turn out, in that way. There's always error. Social systems are complex. Social programs are complex. There are bad things waiting to happen. And there will also be some good and unexpected things which will happen. But that's life. We want to keep our promises to the best, of our ability. And I'm sure the people who favor Medicare for all and who are going to administer it will do their best to keep those promises. That's about all we can say, and all we can do. But in giving our expectations of what HR 676 will accomplish, we are not consciously making promises that we believe we cannot keep. So that covers, point by point, all the objections that I've seen raised so far from the center and from the left in a number of articles and posts that have appeared in the last 2 weeks around the internet. I wanted to give you that review here tonight, what these talking points were, and also the ways to answer them. I hope the ways I've specified are useful to you. What I'd like to do now is, two possible things, okay, that I could do. I could open things up to questions from this point. Okay, from this point on. I could open things up to questions. I'd be very happy to do that. I could also spend some time covering again what's needed to fund a Medicare for All program. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look for your comments and try to get a sense of what you would like me to do in the remaining time we have. And so anyway, if you'd care to make some comments, then I will be happy to try to get a sense of things from those of you who are still here to hear me go through all this. And if you are, then I certainly thank you. Okay, what do you think? Would you like to go through funding again, or just ask some questions? Or make some comments, which I'll now entertain. Okay, let's see. Oh boy, I got lots of comments. ACA should be tweaked, not repealed, somebody says. Tricia Roberts says, let me put this one up on the screen. I want to know how these folks, both sides of the aisle, sleep at night knowing that the U.S. public could have so much better, but they would rather serve their corporate masters. Well, Tricia, okay, I'm not sure that they believe that things could be so much better. There's a lot of cynicism under the bridge over the last 40 years or so. I'm sure that they don't think, many of them do not think that anything could ever be changed. And of course, that's the problem. If they don't believe it, and they will not work for it, then it will never change. So Rita Smith says, the ACA works, keep it. The ACA is still allowing more than 30,000 fatalities per year, Rita. Now, maybe you believe that that works. I mean, maybe it works for you. But I don't think that any supposed health care bill that leaves 30,000 people a year out there to die works. That doesn't work for me, and it doesn't work to the more than 30,000 per year who are dying. Jesus. Can't believe there are still people out there who would say that it should work. Barbara Wernick says the Affordable Care Act should be destroyed. Well, yeah, Barbara. I think it never should have been passed. And Gladdy Funk says the ACA needs enhancement. I don't know what you mean by enhancement, but the point I've been trying to make here, which should be amply attested to during the last 40 years, is that a market-based system does not work. The ACA can't be enhanced and still leave it the ACA, okay, unless it continues to be a market-based system. The ACA needs to die along with the health insurance companies. Yeah, I believe that one too, Stacy. I believe it needs to die. And Rob Baxter asks, what is your position about single payer then? And he's asking Rita, what is your position about single payer? And Teresa Sanders thinks that Gladdy hasn't been listening. And Deborah Cuenza, I hope I pronounced it correctly, says, I invited all 3,500 or so friends to this, one by one. Haha. I felt like I was playing a video game or something. It was fun. Thank you, Deborah. So Rita says, I don't need the ACA. I'm a health insurance agent on Medicare. Aren't you lucky, Rita? I bet you get a pretty good price on those Medicare Advantage plans. And Harriet Garner says, thank you for the invite. I take it, yeah, she's thanking Deborah. If Medicare for All were in place, what happens to health insurance companies? Well, the health insurance companies have to back off to cosmetic services. And if they don't want to do that, then they die. I mean, that's what this is about. They've been guilty for a long time of murder by spreadsheet. And they need to have the death penalty. The Koch suspending $600 million for 2018, says Gigi Schaumburg. Paid trolls beware. Paid trolls indeed. Stacy says, well, Rita, we want you out of a job. Well, Rita, we don't really want you out of a job, but we expect there'll be a government job that you can take, okay, in place of what you've got now. Rita now says, single payer Medicare for all sounds good to me. Well, don't forget, Rita, that's HR 676. Look up the bill, read it. It's short. Well, if it hadn't passed the ACA, then many people with pre-existing conditions wouldn't be covered. It's not perfect. It's modeled after a Republican concept and so on. Well, that's not necessarily true. If it hadn't passed, is a counterfactual. Okay, the point is it did pass. Okay, yet another counterfactual is it might have been the case that instead of taking H.R. 676 off the table in 2009, the president would instead have fully supported H.R. 676 rather than the Affordable Care Act, and that to ensure its passage, he would have had Harry Reid get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. This could have been done in February and March of 2009. And H.R. 676 could have been passed in March or April of 2009. And the implementation of H.R. 676 could have been completed by the early spring of 2010, which is the time when the Affordable Care Act was finally passed. Okay, in that case, in the case of that counterfactual, the 350,000 fatalities that occurred under the Affordable Care Act due to lack of insurance would not have occurred. Would not have occurred, Terry. And of course, it goes without saying, there are no pre-existing conditions under H.R. 676. They don't exist. Oh, so Rita Smith says, sarcasm. Okay, sarcasm. The cheapest form of wit. And James Daniel Richards says, but universal health care is the way to go. It surely is the way to go. But the question is, what form of universal health care? In Switzerland, they have universal health care. It's provided under tight regulations by the government to individuals for $400 a month. That's $4,800 a year. Now that's pretty steep. There are subsidies for very poor people. But some of my friends over there are not that poor. And the $4,800 to pay for universal coverage is really a heavy lift. They could use something like H.R. 676 over in Switzerland. It would cost less for them, and it would also provide truly universal coverage. So the kind of universal coverage that you get counts. They're not all equal. And Bryson McDougall gives the website for the Physicians for a National Health Program. Yes, at pnhp.org. A great site. I'm sorry, it's Bryson McDougall. And Douglas Eriton says Medicare is grossly corrupted by quid pro quo racketeers, just like military $600 hammers and toilet seats. Well, Douglas, I don't know whether Medicare is really quite that bad. I certainly think that it can be cleaned up. I certainly think that it wouldn't be corrupted by insurance companies trying in various ways to make it ineffective. I don't think that would happen. But anyway, HR 676 is a different bill, and its implementation would have some different rules, even though it would use the Medicare apparatus that exists now, even though it would use the bureaucracy that exists now. But it would hire a lot more people for that bureaucracy, many of those coming out of the insurance industry, maybe even Rita Smith. Richard Gammon's going to play devil's advocate. Do you think a system bent on population control will allow us to have single payer? Well, Richard, I don't know whether they would want us to have it, but I think if enough of us stand up for it, it's still possible to deny them the power not to allow us to have it. We can have it these days if we work hard enough and if we get enough people working for it in campaigns for it. Yeah, we're going to need millions. We're going to need millions, no question about it. But we can mobilize those millions. We need to mobilize those millions. Gigi says, adapt or die, as we are expected to do. Yes, I'm afraid that that's the way it is. Or another nicer way of saying it is grow or die. Yes, we have to grow up when it comes to our health care. And Stacy Van Veen says it's buggy whip time. And Patricia Ann Austin loves that answer. And Teresa Sanders says they can supply supplemental insurance. Yeah, Rita could sell cosmetic surgery insurance. She could sell that. Those policies would probably be more expensive anyway, and there'd be higher commissions. So go right to it, Rita. Joe, some people want to hear about funding. Okay, yours is the only request so far. So Deborah Cuenza was invited by Lana Dell. So thank you, Lana. And Deborah says this will be spread far and wide by all of us. We just need to know what to do to help get single payer passed. Watch my videos the last 2 weeks. Both of those dealt with what to do to get it passed. I will start talking about, though, for a little while, I will start talking about now the funding. So Tricia says, if Australia had not had universal health care, my parents probably would have gone broke very quickly when I was young, as I had to go to hospital many times for asthma attacks. Yeah. Also, from what I understand, Australia had universal health care and then backed out of its system for a little while under the Conservatives until the Labour Party was able to get back in and bring it back. I guess people realized that it was a very good thing for Australia. Stacy Van Veen says, love that Barrett Brown interview, Tricia. Yes, Tricia, I loved that the Barrett Brown interview too. He's quite something. Okay, so I think I'm going to go into funding for a little while then. Okay. Somebody asked me a couple of days ago to outline what exactly is needed to fund HR 676 without levying any additional federal taxes beyond the sum total of taxes now collected by states to pay for state Medicare programs and contributions now collected by the federal government under Medicare. Okay, first, Congress has to pass an authorization bill establishing. What happened to me? My head is cut off here. Sorry. First, Congress has to pass an authorization bill establishing the Medicare for All program. Second, Congress has to pass an appropriations bill mandating the spending out of general revenue for the benefits specified in the authorization bill. So notice what I'm saying. The authorization bill would not have any funding provisions in it, only program provisions. The appropriations bill mandates the funding and provides no special provisions for paying for the funding, except the normal tools used by the Treasury Department to pay for anything. Okay. There also should be in the appropriations bill, both in the appropriations bill and the authorization bill, it should be an automatic provision providing first approval of this in the authorization bill and then financing of it in the appropriations bill, providing financing each year to meet the next year's expected costs. This is now done with Medicare Part D. That is the drug benefits that were legislated under the Bush administration. With the automatic provision, funding is never jeopardized without a deliberate act of Congress. So that's something we need in these bills. Third, the authorization bill establishing the program must end the current Medicaid, TRICARE, and Medicare programs. Okay, it doesn't have to end the VA program, though, on second thought. I originally thought it does, but then I thought better, but I don't see any reason why it has to end the VA program if veterans want to use that instead of Medicare for All. Okay, I can't imagine why they would, but they might want to. Okay, while entitling all participants in these programs to benefits under the Medicare for All program. So even though these other programs would be discontinued, all the people who use them now would immediately shift over to the Medicare program. There's no reason why they couldn't use their same doctors if they wanted to, or get other doctors. Right now, their choice of doctors is very limited in these programs and would be much broader in under HR 676. Fourth, Congress must pass tax legislation authorizing federal tax increases to replace state taxes allocated to Medicaid spending and previous payroll contributions for current Medicaid. In other words, what I'm trying to do here is construct things so that there is a bill that shifts the current funding provisions for Medicare and for Medicaid that are provided in state legislation and in federal legislation, and puts them into federal tax legislation. Okay, now why is that? Because we know taxes don't fund spending. Well, taxes don't fund spending, but the function of taxes is to drain reserves from the system, excess reserves from the financial system. So these tax provisions would be shifted over to federal tax programs in order to provide for the reserve drains which are necessary to contain inflation in the economy. Now, this would not touch any new deficit spending that is going to occur under Medicare for All. For example, federal and state programs now are costing something like $1.4 trillion or $1.5 trillion per year. That spending corresponded to $1.6 trillion in reserve drain that happened through taxation. But what I'm proposing is legislation that, say, would result in a total of $2.2 trillion in government spending to cover the whole health insurance system in the United States. Okay? Compare that to the $1.6 trillion that we're spending now, and you see that this would create a federal deficit of $600 billion per year. That's intentional on my part. It's good for the economy. I want that additional deficit spending. But I don't want the whole thing to be covered by deficit spending, because I want to leave policy space for other kinds, okay, of deficit spending. So, that's it. That's the legislation that would be necessary. National Medicare for All funding is provided by the appropriations bill. And tax revenues stay the same by increasing taxes to compensate for ending payroll tax contributions and state taxes for Medicaid. That assumes that state governments will choose to end taxing for their no longer existing Medicaid programs, because those programs, okay, would go away under H.R. 676. Someone might ask the question, well, how does the Treasury get funds in its spending account to implement the spending mandate then? Since there's a deficit there of $600 billion, how does it get those funds into its spending account when it's doing deficit spending? And the answer is the Fed creates new funds in the Treasury spending account, provided the Treasury has enough funds in its account to cover the spending. And then, of course, the next question will be, well, what happens if it doesn't? Well, first, if it does not, then it has to decide whether it wants to ask the Fed to credit its spending accounts with new Fed-created reserves after the Fed destroys the bank reserves corresponding to the $600 billion that might now be existing in its Treasury, tax, and loan accounts. Or, here's the other choice, the other major choice. It wants to ask the Fed to credit Treasury spending account with Fed-created reserves after it deposits coined money in its mint account, specifically a platinum coin, worth the $600 billion, and then calls on the Fed to transfer the seigniorage from that coin from its mint account to its spending account. Now, either of these paths is open to the Treasury. Both involve the Fed creating new reserves in the Treasury spending account. So the way funding occurs is Congress appropriates, and the Fed creates new reserves in the Treasury account for spending. In a very real sense, the funding happens when Congress appropriates, when it mandates the spending. Okay. But then there's the mechanical step of the Treasury having to get the Fed, perhaps, to fill its account with the needed reserves. And remember, the reserves already existing in the Treasury tax and loan account can't be used for the spending because that's not high-powered money. Those reserves have to be destroyed by the Fed first, and then new reserves have to be issued for the Treasury to get high-powered money in its account. That is the only money it can spend on anything the Treasury spends upon. It can only use high-powered money. It doesn't get to use reserves in private banks. That's prohibited. Okay. So, okay, if you go to some of the previous broadcasts, okay, I've had, and you go to the files, that is the Real Progressives page, there are files, you'll find that there are diagrams there that cover the federal government spending process, and that cover the two paths. When the Treasury goes through its TT&L accounts, okay, in order to get the Fed to mark up its Treasury spending account, and also when the Fed wants to use seigniorage, okay, to fill its account, which, by the way, it has never done before. It has sometimes gotten seigniorage in small amounts into its spending account, but it has never tried to fund something like $600 billion, let's say, in deficit spending through seigniorage operations before. But the law is there to do it. I've written a book on the subject, and it's specified in the law. It can be done if the Treasury Secretary wants to use that particular method. But regardless of whether the Treasury Secretary does or does not want to use that particular method, it can always be done through the Treasury tax and loan account in some way. The only thing that can block its being done through this account is when it runs up against the debt ceiling. Then there gets to be a difficult situation, but of course that is not a common thing. A debt ceiling crisis only occurs every few years. And people are learning not to create those kinds of crises because, after all, Congress has already appropriated the funds. So in other words, they've funded the spending already. And they realize it's very dangerous to try to revoke the funding by just leaving the debt ceiling in there. I mean, they might want to keep the law for leverage or stuff like that. But in the end, they always fold because they don't want the federal government to default. Okay. So, to summarize the funding, there are three paths to spending after congressional funding. The Treasury just spends, destroying public sector reserves in the process. When it destroys the public sector reserves, of course, because its account K is marked down, it adds to private sector accounts, because that's how it spends into the private sector. It adds money to people that it wants to pay bills to, or for entitlement spending, or for program spending, okay, of various kinds. It spends by getting private accounts to be marked up by the Fed, and its own public sector reserve accounts destroyed. Okay. Second, it may sometimes have to draw on its TTL accounts at first to get reserves in those accounts destroyed, and then get the Fed to mark up its spending account with new reserves that are created by the Fed. And then finally, there's the coin seniors pass that I just talked about. So that's it for the evening. It's but 12 minutes after 10. I hope people have stopped being uncivil to each other by now. Okay, Teresa missed the reference to TTL. Those are the Treasury tax and loan accounts that Treasury has in the private sector. It has those accounts in private sector banks because when it sells bonds, the money that's paid for the bonds goes into those private sector Treasury accounts. Okay, and also the tax money that you pay, and that you pay using bank money, go into the Treasury tax and loan accounts, which also are filled with the bank reserves. So your final tax payment isn't really settled, okay, until the federal government has the Fed destroy those private sector reserves it has, and then mark up its own spending account with newly created high-powered money in the form of the Fed reserves. So I hope that's clear. TT&L is Treasury tax and loan. Okay, guys. Okay, I think I'm going to call it a night. Mark Fabian says time for that 100T coin. Send me Facebook messages this week. Could be on the public page. For those who want me to cover the 100T coin again.
You're looking up there.
Okay, my wife tells me I'm looking up there again. Okay, and then I will be happy to cover the 100T coin again in my broadcast of next Saturday night. And in the meantime, I hope to get a chance to do some ad hoc live streams in the coming week. I've been trying to clear the deck to do that, so far unsuccessfully, but I'm very serious about it. And eventually I am going to get to that. So for now, I'm going to say good night. I hope you had a good time, and I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you know how to answer the people who are raising these objections to H.R. 676. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later. Thank you. Yeah, I keep on sort of, I don't know, I think I need this further away, but I like to have it a little closer to me, but then the angle is not right. I think I'm going to have to find a way to prop this up a little so that the angle is right.
If I could tell.
Oh, it said to end the live broadcast. It didn't end it, so